Hey guys, Editing Jared here. If you are here from the other video, welcome back. If you just clicked on this one by chance, so this is the second half of my end of year reading tier list. The first half is available on my channel if you want to see some of my thoughts on the books that are already ranked here, but if not, feel free to just keep watching with this one. We're talking about some great series. I'm excited to get into it. I see that S tier is getting a little crowded. I like to think of myself as someone who doesn't just throw everything in S tier, but I've read a lot of really good books this year, I feel like. Moving on next, we've got the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. Now, I was not familiar with Douglas Adams' work before reading this series, outside of a few passing references I'd come across in other media, and maybe like a quarter of the way into the first book, I immediately understood the hype. This man writes words in a way that just make me think, I don't think I've ever heard anyone write this way before. The most classic example is probably a sentence where he's describing spaceships coming to destroy the Earth, claiming they hung in the sky in much the same way that bricks don't. I probably will have to do a full video on this series because there's so many lines and scenes and just concepts that are pure genius. If you think you enjoy that wacky, absurd British humor, I can't recommend these books enough. Some of them become more hit or miss as they go on, in my opinion. The first one I will absolutely say S tier. The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, I'm going to put it in A for now. It could probably go in S tier just as easily though. Book 3, Life, the Universe, and Everything. B tier on that one. So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, I'm also going to go B tier on. I really enjoyed Arthur finally getting some happiness in his life after all of his troubles. This book just felt like such a warm hug compared to his misfortune in all the previous ones, and I enjoyed it a lot for that. And I'm describing my enjoyment of this book because I think it would have been an excellent stopping point for the series, but we of course got book 5, Mostly Harmless, which is a book that I am unspeakably mixed on. I don't want to rant too much, but the ending to this book was so abrupt and frankly unsatisfying that I just had my jaw on the floor for like a full minute before texting my friend, "Really? That's how it ends?" I understand that Douglas Adams had expressed some regret over ending the book how he did, and that he was struggling with depression at the time of writing it, and wanted to do another book in the series, though he unfortunately passed away before he got the chance. So ultimately, we get left with what I would consider one of the bleakest endings in a series I've ever read. I'm so torn because I was actually enjoying a lot of the stuff going on before the ending. We were getting some decent character growth with Arthur, and Ford's side plot had me laughing, but what a conclusion. I'll go C tier on this one. I really resented this book for a good while after finishing it. It's not a bad book, just maybe a little misguided at times. After that, we've got And Another Thing, which is actually the next Hitchhiker's book. This one was written in 2010 by Owen Colfer, most notably author of the Artemis Fowl books, which I never read, so I was going in blind to his writing style. He wrote this to give the fans a satisfying conclusion, and I believe he had the blessing of Adam's wife or estate, one or the other. So it's all in good fun, and this book feels like a solid bonus adventure, some DLC if you will. I did enjoy it a decent bit, but it is lacking a certain quality that the Adams books brought. We get a lot of page time in this book with side characters who are interesting enough, but I think it focuses a little too much on them. And again, this book sort of flubs the ending. The final 5 minutes or so had me ready to throw hands. I'm sorry, I have to vent just a little bit. I understand that Arthur's entire purpose as a character is just to have the worst luck in the universe, but I couldn't help but feeling a little bit betrayed. It's a C tier on this one as well, although I still can't recommend this series enough. My personal desire to see the characters be happy might just be clouding my judgment a little bit. we're moving on. Okay, up next we've got Alchemy Online. So after finishing Dungeon Crawler Carl, I was seeking out more lit RPG series, thinking, okay, this was actually really good, maybe I'll be surprised again. These audiobooks were on sale in like a 3-in-1 pack, so I scooped them up just so I could have a lot of listening cut out for me. The best I can say though is that these books just weren't for me. This sort of follows the age-old premise of people uploading their consciousness into an MMORPG. The game itself is like a steampunk-inspired high fantasy world called Alchemy. The opening premise before we get into the game had me pretty invested. Essentially, there's a plague wiping out the population, there's a world war that our main character was a soldier in, and there is a sort of steadily brewing thermonuclear Cold War on top of all that. The main protagonist, Hector, contracts the virus and, long story short, gets uploaded into the game to preserve his consciousness. I was really hoping to see some of those bigger picture plot elements play into the story a little more, but after a little while it becomes clear that we aren't going to be leaving the game world, and most of the focus centers around the quest lines in Alchemy. All of the player characters in the game are from the real world, so we do still get brief glimpses of what's going on outside, but what we get just wasn't enough to really hold my interest, because at the end of the day, the focus really is just about the game world. My other big gripe with this series is that death never felt like much of a consequence. Players die and respawn and it's kind of whatever. They do hint at like a corruption that can happen if you die too many times, but for the most part, that threat never really feels tangible. As the books go on, the camaraderie between the main cast becomes pretty nice. That was really what kind of kept me pushing through. I'll just go ahead and get through these. Dragon Seed is D tier, just wasn't for me. Trial by Fire, this one was probably my favorite. It had a murder mystery quest going on that I thought was fairly well constructed. We do get introduced to some good characters who become mainstays going forward. I'm feeling kind of generous, so I'll put that in B tier. Kingdom Come, we sort of begin this backward slide from the previous book for me. This one, yeah, there's like a big army of undead they have to fight. It's just a C tier for me. War Singer, now I thought I'd love this one with mechs being introduced, but again, the complaints I have kind of just about the series as a whole keep cropping up. Another C tier. Book 5, Spear of Destiny. This one was losing me as well. It's gonna be a D tier. I'm sorry, James Osiris Baldwin, you're a fine writer. It's not you, it's me. It just wasn't really for me. But I plan to finish the series out, so you know, I'll keep reading. Now we come to the Jeanette McCurdy memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died. This is a pretty heavy look into her upbringing, her struggle with eating disorders, and living with an abusive mother. It can be a hard read, although it does stay light on its feet for the most part. McCurdy has a knack for this dry sort of humor that lands really well, even during some of the heavier moments. I'll go A tier. I think I liked it better than that Alchemy Online book, so yeah, A tier on that. Now we've got World War Z by Max Brooks. This one's really well known. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It's a very interesting take on the zombie apocalypse for sure. I enjoyed it for what it was. If I had to nitpick, I'd say like any anthology, there are some weaker and some stronger stories. I felt like a few of them were just sort of meh. I think a lot of it really just sort of felt like the author's voice rather than different characters. It's still certainly enjoyable. It's going to be a B tier for me. Now moving on again, we've got Frank Herbert's Dune, landmark science fiction series, really needs no introduction. Much like Lord of the Rings, there's nothing I can say about these books that hasn't already been said. I was lucky enough not to have seen any of the movies that have come out, so I actually got to go in completely blind here. To no one's surprise, this first book is going in the S tier. It's a fantastic exploration of the Messiah archetype that blends science fiction and mysticism into an epic existential package. There's something just otherworldly about this story, and particularly this first book. which leads us to the 2 sequels I read this year. The first of which is Dune Messiah. I don't know, is it a hot take to put this right up here with the first book? From what I could gather from its introduction, this book was sort of written, at least partially, in response to some readers misinterpreting the first book, and to sort of illustrate the dangers of messianic leaders. I just feel like this book is such a perfect extension of the first, and almost reads like an extended epilogue of sorts. I really can't imagine reading the first book without picking this one up right after. They just feel like a cohesive 1-2 punch to me. I think Frank Herbert does lean in to some more of the sci-fi nonsense with this book. One character's death sort of gets a retcon, but I was okay with it because of where Frank Herbert went with that character and kind of their path to gaining their humanity back after being reborn. I especially loved the ending of this book. I felt like it was very poetic and just a really good way to send off the series. If Dune as a series was just these 2 books, it would still feel so full and complete. But we do get the 3rd book, Children of Dune. And if you look at my Goodreads, you'll actually see that this book slumped me for quite a while. It took me like 4 or 5 months to really finish this one. I don't know what it was, I just had to take a break for a bit. There's not a single page of Children of Dune that's poorly written. If anything, it feels like Frank Herbert's trying to outdo himself more often than not. In the pursuit of that, sometimes it feels like the book just forgets to be enjoyable to read. As with the first 2 books, there are political plots within plots going on here, and we have so many characters and point of views established by this point in the story. While it is diligently orchestrated with extreme efficiency, it just got a little overwhelming for me to keep up with it all. I do think the back end of the book picks up tremendously though, particularly chapter 52 onward. If you know, you know. When we drop some of the yapping and just get into that delectable weirdness and chaos is when I feel like this book really peaks. I could definitely see S tier on this book. That said, it is going to go in A tier for now, and I'm excited to continue my journey with the Dune series heading into the new year. After that, we've got Happy People Are Annoying, which is Josh Peck's memoir. If you're a fellow Zillennial like me, you grew up with Drake and Josh, and after reading Jeanette McCurdy's book, this one was recommended to me by the algorithm. It's a short but sweet read. It delves into his troubles with eating, being a child actor, and drug use. Don't want to put it in C tier, but it was just kind of something I read in a day. It's a fine read, but it didn't stick with me that much throughout the year. Now after that, we get to the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. I would read these books some as a child, and I was curious to revisit them now that I'm sort of back into the world of literature. Warts and all, it's an interesting series to get through. We'll just sort of plow through them here. This might be a little cursed, but the first one I'm gonna rank as The Magician's Nephew, because that was the first one I read, even though I know it was the 6th book that was written. It's the first chronologically, and that's just how the set that I had listed them. And maybe I just needed a little bit of a lighter story at the time when I read this. I enjoyed this one a lot more than I thought I would. There's some really great concepts in here. The Wood Between Worlds was a awesome multiversal kind of addition to the lore. The kids going to the dying world, Charn, was surprisingly grim and fitting as an introduction to Jadis, or the White Witch as she's better known. Her coming to our world and causing a stir was kind of ridiculous, but in the best way. This was just a really fun book that honestly did surprise me. It's gonna go in the A tier. Next up, we do have The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I'll say this one definitely holds up, especially in the context of being a children's story. I imagined, would I read this to my son, who's almost at the age I was when I first came across this book, and I think it would certainly pique his interest. I gotta give this the S tier. It's one of C.S. Lewis's most enduring works for a reason. After that is Prince Caspian. I might catch some flack, but I really can't lie, I don't remember much about this book. We're gonna run with the B tier. I remember liking it generally speaking. Next up is Voyage of the Dawn Treader. This one was losing me a bit. There is some really solid character writing going on in a few of these sort of vignettes. At the end of the day, it just wasn't holding my attention too strongly though. Gonna go C tier on that one. After that, we get to the Silver Chair. Now this one was awesome. Some really crazy moments, like the kids finding out they're about to be eaten by the giants and having to escape. A little horrifying when you think about it. The Underland was an awesome addition to the world, and I really liked having another witch protagonist. And the sort of lack of information regarding if she has any relation to the White Witch, it sort of leaves a lot to the imagination about the broader world in a very good way. It was also nice to see Eustace not be such a prick in this one. Great book. A tier on that one. Oh boy, and these last two. The Horse and His Boy. Now, even if we disregard some of the problematic elements of this book, this one feels the most unnecessary of all the Narnia books in my opinion. I like the core idea of like a talking horse trying to make his way back to Narnia, but most of the plot just kind of felt like random contrivances. That's even ignoring the elephant in the room, being that the Calormen are basically just depicted as being Middle Eastern with some unflattering stereotypes. Of course, they're made out to be enemies of Aslan, who, as we all know, is God incarnate in the most literal sense. Yeah, this one's gonna go D tier. And last but least, we have The Last Battle, and I really wish we could just not. This book it's the Revelations allegory for Narnia, and it just feels so misplaced and just bad. Nothing in this book evokes the wonder of Narnia. It's dour and depressing and overwrought with its messaging about the end times and false gods, who coincidentally are once again propagated by the Calormen. Just a terrible ending to this series, and I was overjoyed to be finished with it. That is F tier. Get it out of here. After that, we're moving right on to Yellow, another Aaron Beauregard classic. Okay, so this book is apparently an homage to Charles Bronson revenge vigilante movies. I totally get the appeal, but elements of this book in particular just didn't feel as inspired as some of the other deep dives into depravity from Aaron Beauregard that I read this year. The inciting incident for the main character's revenge spree was just kind of off-putting. Maybe I just wasn't in the mood to read about a guy with a chip on his shoulder against everyone. This book just felt a little more mean-spirited, if that's even possible. I know how stupid that sounds to say, given the other books the author's written. This one just felt dark and nihilistic, and I'm just gonna go D tier on it. It wasn't for me personally. We're getting into that home stretch here. We only have one more row of books to get through. This next one is Desolation by Mark Morton, the guitarist for Lamb of God, a band that I'm a massive fan of. So I'll try not to just geek out about them because this video is already going to be extremely long. This was an excellent read. Chronicles his upbringing, maneuvering in and out of different music scenes, the band's rise to fame, and his struggles with drug addiction and personal hardship along the way. Definitely worth reading if you're a fan of the band or wanting a story about the path to sobriety. Gonna put that one in the B tier. And again, I'm kind of starting to wish I just did a separate tier for memoirs or something, because it feels kind of weird ranking these, as I mentioned earlier, but oh well, it comes with the territory, I guess. Next up, we have another horror novel, The Har, by David Sodergren, described as a Scottish horror fairy tale. This definitely has some pseudo-gothic romance elements as well. It's a pretty short book about an old woman trying to resist having her home bought out by this Jeff Bezos-like tycoon who I believe wants to build a golf course on her property. Really excellent atmosphere in this book. The situations that come from the supernatural creature she discovers escalate very quickly into a conclusion that I personally loved. I was gonna go B tier on this one. Might go A. Yeah, I'm just gonna go A tier on that one. Next up, we've got Choreography, the memoir of one Corey Feldman. I kind of did this one due to Corey Feldman's meme status. He is just an interesting figure in the pop culture landscape, especially if you're familiar with his musical career. This book does go pretty heavily into the toxic landscape of Hollywood and show business in general, particularly a lot of the grooming and much worse things that happen when the cameras are off. It's a sobering read, but I am left a bit mixed on it in the wake of some allegations against Corey himself by some of the people affiliated with his Corey's Angels talent agency, or whatever you want to call it. The whole thing is pretty weird. This book was written before any of that stuff was even really a thing, so I'm ultimately just left unsure of how to feel about this one. I'm gonna put that in the C tier. C for Corey, I guess. Okay, Never Whistle at Night. This is an anthology of different short stories from indigenous native authors, particularly focusing on a horror theme, or at least involving darker elements of native folklore and the long-term effects of colonization. There are 26 different stories here, I believe, so there's a lot to sink your teeth into. A lot of my favorites weren't even dealing with the supernatural, but just with the human side of nature. Some of them have really stuck with me. I'm gonna put this one up in the A tier. Next up here we have the Wolf of the North trilogy by Duncan M. Hamilton. This was a pretty short but sweet Norse-inspired high fantasy series. It's mostly a revenge, coming-of-age kind of story. Lots of blood, lots of treachery, lots of fighting for your honor, with a surprising amount of heartfelt moments as well. I feel like the ending to the series left a little bit to be desired. Things wrapped up just a little too quickly, in my opinion, but I think all three of these books can go in the B tier. They were all just some good, enjoyable fantasy. Alright, the next book we have is Babel, or The Necessity of Violence by R.F. Kuang. This was my first book I read by R.F. Kuang, and if they're all gonna rip my heart out like this one did, consider me on board. This is kind of a historical fiction set in 1830s England, I believe. It's following a Chinese orphan who's taken in by a wealthy Oxford professor who kind of raises him to be used in the translation department at the college. There are a lot of ruminations on etymology and the power of language, which is fitting because in this world, the sort of magic system, if you want to call it that, is based on language itself and on utilizing different languages from around the world. The way this magic or power is harnessed involves the use of these silver bars that England has a monopoly over. It's hard to get into specifics without going on like a long explanation about it all, but it's described very well in the book, and it ties directly into the overt anti-colonial messaging. And ultimately, this is a story about academia's implicitness in imperialism and gentrification. I could probably do a whole video about this book alone, so I'm just going to leave it here by saying this was an excellent read, and if any of those themes interest you, I strongly recommend this one. Definitely going with the S tier on this one. Up next, we have The Stand. So Stephen King is an author who I've failed to get into in the past. I could never make it past some of his tangents and his long-winded style of writing. So that said, of course, I picked his longest book to try and read, and I do not have enough words to explain how good The Stand is. I'll probably have to do a separate video just talking about this book, but for the uninitiated, it tells the story of a virus outbreak that wipes out 99% of the population, and the survivors who band together into two fundamentally different camps in the outcome of their struggles. Partially inspired by The Lord of the Rings, it is an epic beginning to end, and I actually found myself grateful for King's long-windedness this time around, because this is exactly the type of story that needs that attention to detail. Beginning from the ground up with the early cases of infection and detailing all of the little common daily activities that build up to the eventual collapse of life as we know it, it really feels like he leaves no stone unturned. There's a fan favorite chapter that covers a lot of the different deaths after society has already collapsed. If you know, you know, that's just such a harrowingly written chapter. I loved the ensemble cast in this one. Every character is so vividly fleshed out and realized, and King allows them to be flawed and allows the reader to contemplate these characters' mistakes. I see a lot of people list this as their favorite Stephen King book, and I do have to wonder if there's anything else that can really top it for me. This is a strong contender for my favorite book I read this year. It is definitely right up there with Death's End. Up next is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, another classic author who I never got into. This book has sent me on a dinosaur kick. Some of the passages and descriptions are so tense and horrifying. One of my favorite is the section with the T-Rex swimming after the people in the water, kind of being compared to a crocodile. Something about that image is like unlocking a primal fear within me. I do think Crichton tends to insert himself into some of these characters more than I would like. Obviously, I'm mostly referring to Ian Malcolm's long-winded speeches, but towards the end of the book, you kind of just accept that that's a feature of his writing more than a hindrance. Really hovering between A and S tier for this one. I think I'll go S tier just for iconography's sake, if anything else. Following that up, we also have The Lost World, which is the sequel to Jurassic Park. Not going to spend a lot of time on this one. There's a lot of information out there about how Crichton didn't want to write a sequel. He didn't usually write them as a kind of a rule, but he got paid a buttload of money to write this one, and this book just kind of reads like one that was written by someone who got paid a buttload of money to write it. It's still entertaining enough though, and I enjoyed some of the rants about evolution. I'm gonna put this one in the B tier. Not a bad book by any means. Coming back to Stephen King with Salem's Lot. So The Stand had my interest in his other books peaked, and I'll be the first to say that vampires were never my go-to monster of choice, but I read this at a friend's recommendation, and I think King once again just writes a brilliant story. What really sells this book for me is that it's just as much about the horror of these small towns that seem destined to stagnate and die as it is about actual vampires. Jerusalem's Lot is depicted as a bit of an untrustworthy community. I feel like the townspeople don't always have the most flattering impressions of each other, and maybe that is part of their downfall. I love the way King let the tension linger in this book, and when the vampire stuff does finally start happening, it's done exceedingly well. I particularly loved the main antagonist in this book. I felt like he was such a looming presence in this story. Again, I'm between A and S tier. I feel like I'm gonna have to go S tier on this one. Let's see, now we come to Page Boy. Elliot Page's memoir dives into a lot of his personal struggles with gender dysphoria and the emotional abuse he faced growing up. Powerful read. I'll go B tier, I guess, just because there's a lot of times in this book where it's not very clear what period of Elliot's life we're in, and that was a little jarring to me as a reader. It just wasn't always the most succinct experience that I feel like it could have been, but if you're a fan of his work or just wanting to support queer artists, absolutely worth a read. Finally, we are closing everything out with Winter Swim by Ryan W. Bradley, gritty, brutal novella that takes place in a small Alaskan town and follows a boy who suspects his father may be related to the murders of some local teenage girls. Definite trigger warning for SA. This book almost just has one scene too many. Other than that though, the author maintains a steady sense of foreboding across the story. He really sells the rural Alaskan setting, and while I would have preferred a little more mystery regarding the identity of the killer, it's still an engaging enough ride worth your time if you like these insanely gritty crime thrillers. I also want to shout out his prose as well. I feel like he lets the reader fill in a lot of the blanks, which works in tandem with the brevity of this story to give it even more of an impact. Gonna go B tier on this one. That is really gonna wrap up the tier list here. If I have to pick like a favorite book I read this year, it is absolutely between Death's End and The Stand. Personally, I would probably give it to Death's End. This book was just so far out and full of so many crazy concepts, but both books were extremely compelling and just masterfully written. Editing Jared, again, cutting in here. I've compiled a more comprehensive list of some of my favorites of the year. My favorite book overall, as just mentioned, is Death's End. I don't think I've read a more compelling celebration of life and impermanence that is also able to balance such intense feelings of despair and hope. I'd recommend the 3 Body Problem series to any sci-fi reader. My favorite standalone novel, so one that's not part of a series, is definitely The Stand. This is just a true epic in every sense of the word. My favorite ongoing series is definitely Dungeon Crawler Carl. I cannot wait for Book 7's audiobook release this year. Definitely expect to see that on the list for next year. My favorite memoir I read this year was absolutely Down with the System by Serge Tankian. I came for the band stuff and stayed for the beautiful ruminations on art and the soul. My favorite horror novel, I'm gonna have to give it to Salem's Lot, although definite shout out to The Har by David Sodergren. Salem's Lot is immaculately written, and I loved how surprisingly well these traditional gothic vampires fit into the small American town setting. Now my favorite extreme horror or splatterpunk book is gonna have to be The Slob. I felt like I had to make a separate slot for this genre. Traditionally, horror to me speaks more to the internalized fears we all face, and as a genre, explores how they can manifest and shape our view of the world. Extreme horror, on the other hand, is a contest of how close a book can get me to throwing up. The Slob was the clear winner. My favorite fantasy book I read this year, I'm gonna have to go The Well of Ascension. This book expounded on everything I loved about the first, gave me more reasons to love the characters and feel their pain, all while adding a lot to the world building and further exploring the magic system established in the first book. My favorite sci-fi book, it's gonna go to Dune. I'm not letting myself include Death's End because it's my favorite overall book, so of course it would be my favorite sci-fi book. Dune establishes such a lived-in and massive universe and touches on so many concepts from ecology to religion that there's just no way to quickly summarize it and do it justice. The more time that passes since my initial read-through, the more I can't wait to revisit it. I can definitely see it becoming an all-time favorite. Favorite anthology, Never Whistle at Night. The wide range of stories offer plenty to sink your teeth into, and the themes of colonization and profound loss in them make them impossible to forget. My favorite new release, so a book that came out this year, I'll also give to Down with the System. Granted, I didn't read many 2024 releases because there's just so much on my reading list, but this one did stick with me all throughout the year. And my least favorite book I read this year, easily The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis. Obviously, for all the previous reasons I listed in the video, it just reads like an extremely jaded and depressing attempt at a children's epic, and that's not even mentioning the intense Islamophobic undertones. Avoid this one like the plague. If you made it to the end of the video, I just want to say thank you for watching this far. I had a lot of fun making this list and compiling my thoughts on these books. If there are any you want me to do a separate video on, or just any books in general you'd like me to check out, definitely let me know in the comments. I hope you all take care, and peace out until next time.